Wednesday, August 30. Love your wife as you do yourself. What new argument does Paul use to encourage husbands to practice tender love toward their wives? We read Ephesians 5:28-30. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. Paul's rules for the Christian household in Ephesians 5:21 through to chapter 6 verse 9 disclose a challenging social context. In Ephesians 5:28-30, which we've just read, Paul addresses husbands who, following the all too frequent pattern of the time, may choose to hate their own flesh, abusing and beating their wives. In the Greco-Roman world of Paul's day, the legal power of the father of the family, Latin pater familias, was very broad. He could punish harshly or even kill his wife, children, and slaves, and be within his legal rights, though exercising such power in extreme ways was increasingly constrained by public opinion. In Ephesians 5:25-27, Paul has detailed the ultimate example of love, Christ's love for the church, offering a drastically different model for husbands than the usual one. Now, before laying out a new argument, he points again to that great example, asking Christian husbands to respond in the same way in verse 28 as Jesus, who gave himself up for his bride, the church, and attends to her every needs. Paul challenges Christian husbands to turn from the expected practices of their time and seek to match Christ's tender love. In Ephesians 5:28-30, Paul adds a new rationale to support the love of Christian husbands for their wives: self-love. Paul offers a truism. No one ever hated his own flesh, at least no one thinking clearly. Husbands don't harm themselves or beat up on their own bodies. Instead, they nourish and cherish them, we read in verse 29. In a bid to eliminate harshness and violence against Christian wives, Paul invites the Christian husband to identify with his wife. You are so much one with your wife, Paul argues, that to harm her is nothing short of inflicting self-harm. And most people in their right minds don't do that. Returning to the example of Jesus, Paul argues that Christ is himself practicing tender self-care in cherishing believers who are his body, in verses 29 and 30. Model your behavior towards your wife, says Paul, on the way you treat yourself and ultimately on the way Christ treats you. And so to finish today, Paul cites the example of Jesus to both wives and husbands. What can you learn from Jesus about loving those in your own family circle?